Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today, I'd like to dig into the watches of James Bond. Watches are an essential part of the James Bond iconography. When you think of James Bond, you think of the dinner jacket, you think of the Aston Martin, you think of the Walter PPK, and you think of the watch. And what watch Bond has worn has shifted a lot over the years. I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about how each Bond has had a slightly different relationship to his watches, starting with Fleming and going on. This video may run into a two-part series. We'll see how this conversation goes, but if it starts to run long, I may cut it into a two-part series because I think there's a lot to explore there. Watches are near and dear to my heart. I've dabbled with the watch collector community on and off over the years. I used to go to watch collector meetups and different things like that, and I still follow watch news very closely. So this is a subject that I think a lot about, even outside of the framework of James Bond. I'm very interested in the mechanics of watchmaking, the history of iconic watch brands, and that aligns very nicely with James Bond. In fact, one of the reasons I think I probably, as a child, kind of hooked into the Bond iconography is because when I was introduced to Bond as a character, he embodied so many things that I had some previous fascination with. From a very young age, from like as young as 2 years old, I was fascinated by clocks and watches. And so when I was introduced to this character who, at the time in the Brosnan years, had a laser watch, I mean, that was the height of coolness to a young pre-adolescent mind. So let's start at the beginning here with Bond and watches, and that is Fleming's Bond. Fleming's Bond initially wore not a Rolex, as is often established. I mean, the association between Bond and Rolex comes pretty early in the Fleming canon, but Fleming specified to a fan who wrote in that Bond actually wore relatively cheap, expendable wristwatches. And that made sense because Ian Fleming's Bond likes to use watches as a knuckle duster. So he would, it was a utilitarian object. It was field equipment. You wouldn't wear a super expensive watch on missions where you knew that watch was going to be damaged and need to be replaced. And that was kind of Fleming's position for a while. Yes, Bond wore Rolex, but it was more of like a tactical thing. And what changed for the character was largely that Fleming was gifted a Rolex Explorer. It's a beautiful model. It's actually, I think, the loveliest Rolex to be associated with Bond. I know people think of the iconography of the Submariner, which was introduced as Bond's watch in the Connery years, but for me, the Fleming Rolex Explorer is really the apex of the Rolex Bond watch association, and it made sense for the character, even in the context of practicality, because it's such an incredible piece of functional equipment, or at least it was at that point in history in the mid-20th century. Rolex now is positioned very differently as a brand than it was in the mid-20th century. It's very much a luxury brand now. It's hard to get Rolexes at retail, especially the more desirable models. It is, and the price points are very expensive. At the time in the mid-20th century, it was possible to, looking at like American salary data, the median American salary, like one person's monthly salary, if they had saved that up equivalent, they could get a Rolex. Today, that doesn't really hold. Proportionally, Rolexes are much more expensive. They're a much less attainable luxury good. But Rolex was really like seen as the the premium tool watch. Like, this was a functional tool watch that was able to withstand the greatest stress that you would put on a watch. It was the marketing campaigns. If you look at vintage Rolex marketing campaigns, they're probably my favorite marketing campaigns in any watch brand's history, emphasizing that this was a watch that you would wear to Everest or diving or flying a plane. Like, it was the utilitarian watch, and you wanted this watch because it was dependable. It was the watch that was going to hold up under stress. And given that consideration, it really makes sense that Fleming and his creation would be attached to what Rolex represented at that time. This very simple but elegant tool watch. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, that the Bond's watches are essentially, as like established as part of the character very early on, a utilitarian choice that has kind of shifted over the years with different Bond actors and their different attitudes towards luxury culture. But Fleming's Bond was not a particularly rich guy. He spent a lot of money because he didn't expect to live long, right? And he lived well in the time he had. But Fleming's Bond has a pretty disdainful attitude towards luxury culture and rich people in general. He drives a fancy sports car, yes, but it's a fancy sports car that a rich guy, essentially totaled, and Bond has like lovingly restored this thing after getting a really good deal on it. Like, that's kind of Bond's attitude. He's sitting in the middle of this class structure. He's not really a luxury culture guy, and so his attire, his watches, that's not really coming from a place of him envying the lifestyles of the rich and famous. It's more about, this is a really dependable object. And that carries over into the Connery years. Now, the Connery years are interesting in the sense that the first watch Connery's Bond wears is not a Rolex. In Dr. No, the first watch he's actually seen wearing is a Gruen. And a Gruen was not a particularly expensive wristwatch, but it's a simple gold dress watch. And there's something that Connery's Bond does that I wish they would kind of follow the template of in later installments that they kind of drop. But he has a sense for, at least in these first installments, of appropriateness of wearing a watch. Our image of Bond these days is like Bond wears a diving watch with a dinner jacket. And that is carried to an extreme in the Craig era. But really, Bond had a better sense of decorum, at least as Connery's Bond was introduced, where he's wearing a very simple gold-toned dress watch with a dinner jacket. That's very appropriate. That's following the rules of formal attire to his point. Some people will say you shouldn't even wear a watch with a dinner jacket, but it's well-established behavior, even going way back into the 20th century, that people were wearing watches with black tie. That's not a novel idea. It's kind of like, it was kind of one of those rules that you'll hear, sticklers bring up every once in a while, but it really never held culturally, as far as we can tell. But Bond had this sense where he was still wearing dress watches when appropriate. This shifts in terms of cultural idea a little bit when you get to Goldfinger, but I think what people forget about Goldfinger, when Connery is introduced wearing the Rolex Submariner on that NATO strap, he has just come from a diving sequence, right? He strips off the wetsuit and he's got the dinner jacket underneath. He's wearing tactical gear. That watch and the NATO strap is part of a tactical assignment. It's the contrast of purposes he has there. It's not the watch he would have picked from his drawer, so to speak, if he were just getting dressed up for black tie. And that kind of iconography has stayed with the character from that point forward. This idea of this character who is associated primarily with the diving watch. It's really a creation of the Connery era. In fact, the fact that it was the particular Submariner model was kind of done by accident, because it was one of these things where they were shooting and they needed to give Bond a watch, and I believe it was Harry Saltzman who just took off his Rolex, which was on that time on a leather strap, and just put it on Connery's wrist. And that's kind of how the Rolex Submariner became the iconic Bond watch as far as movies were concerned. But it's worth noting that, like, the Connery Bond is not really like a gadget watch guy. Yes, he has the Geiger counter watch in Thunderball, which was built off of a Breitling, but it doesn't really have a brand association in the film that you could pick up on, and it's so heavily modified that nobody would recognize it as a Breitling, at least in that time. You know, we now recognize it as Bond fans that it was a Breitling top time. But it's interesting that Connery's Bond is not really like the gadget watch guy. The guy who actually has the gadget watch, the most significant gadget watch in the Connery years, is Red Grant in From Russia with Love, with his little, like, his strangle watch, garrote, cord watch. So it's kind of interesting that part of the character's iconography really is only introduced with Roger Moore right from the get-go in Live and Let Die. But before we get to talking about Roger Moore, it's kind of interesting that Connery's Bond is one who actually never really settles on a clear wristwatch. Yes, Goldfinger has the most iconic moment, but Bond is still, in some of the later movies, still wearing the Gruen dress watch that he was introduced wearing in Dr. No. Sometimes he's wearing the Submariner. You see him in Thunderball wearing the Breitling. And then when George Lazenby comes in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the Rolex Association is there again, but he also gets the advantage of wearing a chronograph. Bond doesn't get to wear many chronographs. I think the Rolex chronograph that George Lazenby wears for portions of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the loveliest Bond watch. As a watch fan, I actually think that is a cooler Rolex than the Submariner. It's less iconic, but it is one of the most beautiful chronographs that Rolex ever produced. And you kind of see that, like, the relationship between Bond and the Bond watch, so to speak, hadn't really quite settled when you're looking at the 1960s. And it really settles with Live and Let Die, which introduces the gadget watch to end all gadget watches. And this is also the era in which it really leans into this idea that Bond is issued watches by Q Branch. That Bond's watches are not necessarily expressions of his personal taste, but issued equipment. And you get that from the very start. So I'm actually, as I record this video, I decided to put on the Hamilton reissue of the Live and Let Die Pulsar. That watch we're told, is kind of like his placeholder while Q Branch is outfitting his Rolex Submariner with all this intense gadgetry, the buzzsaw, the magnetic field gadgetry. That stuff is so cool. It's so well used in the movie. It's a gadget that keeps coming back throughout the entire film, that it really firmly associates Bond with the Rolex Submariner. There's not another watch in the series that gets such like a loving treatment over and over again in the same movie the way the Rolex Submariner does in Live and Let Die. And I think even as much as Goldfinger established this idea that the Rolex Submariner is integral to the Bond iconography, it's really Live and Let Die that made that like a firm part of the Bond character DNA, that this character wears a diving watch, which makes a certain level of sense given Bond's naval background, right? Bond is firmly associated with a naval background, so it makes sense that he would wear a watch associated with that sort of naval activity in some capacity. So the Submariner is in many ways an ideal watch for the character. but really it's the gadgetry that I think makes it for the character. But it's interesting that Roger Moore's Bond is actually more associated with digital watches, and starting with the Pulsar, that there's this sense that because it's Q branch issued equipment, Bond is actually given watches that were at the time on the cutting edge, which were the digital watches. So Roger Moore's Bond becomes more strongly associated with Seiko overall, starting with The Spy Who Loved Me, where he's getting the message on his watch in the pre-title sequence, going all the way through, the wonderful model in Octopussy, where he's using it to track the Fabergé egg. There is such strong sense of like the era tied up there with Roger Moore's Bond wearing these digital watches. And I'll admit, as a kid watching the Bond movies, I thought these digital watches were the coolest. As much as I thought, like the Submariner is cool, and today I think the Submariner is cooler than a lot of these digital Seiko models. At the time when I was being introduced to Bond, I thought stuff like the Octopussy watch was the height of, coolness for Bond watches, these sort of digital displays. There's something sort of tactical about them. And while now digital watches have kind of moved into an awkward place where at the time they were cutting edge, at the time they were expensive, at the time this was novel technology, but now they kind of, everybody thinks of them as being like lower rent now, because mechanical watchmaking is how the Swiss watch industry really realigned itself in order to establish itself as a luxury good in the wake of the population of much cheaper battery-powered watches, which really took over the world. It's called the quartz crisis. It almost destroyed the Swiss watch industry. They kind of rallied around this idea of tradition and mechanical watchmaking. And that's what reigns supreme today. But like at the time, these things were cutting edge, these sort of digital watches. And in some ways, they make sense for the character. They're robust tools. They could do a lot. They were high-tech. They seemed high-tech. And as sort of Q branch issued equipment, they make a nice evolution from something like the gadget-laden Submariner, because there's so much you can do with it, like the TV screen watch that Bond gets. Like you can keep expanding new layers onto that. Today, that seems a little less novel in the world of the Apple Watch, right? An Apple Watch brings the entire world to your wrist, and in some ways that seems less cool in the smartphone world. It actually, the smartwatch is kind of redundant with a smartphone. So in order to reestablish the place of the watch in Bond's iconography, they kind of have had to move away from that like computerized tech, even while in the 1980s that made a lot of sense to be a focal area for what kind of watch a secret agent would be wearing. Now, with the character's iconography, it's almost been doing a version of what they kind of explicitly lay out in Skyfall, which is that Bond is kind of an analog guy in a digital world, right? He kind of goes back to these things like traditional suiting and traditional watchmaking, and he appreciates the way he can depend on that level of craftsmanship. And that's kind of how the character has evolved. But we're getting to the 20-minute mark here as I'm recording this video, so I'm gonna pause things here with just a quick realignment on how the Fleming years, the Connery years, and the Roger Moore years kind of established this trajectory of the Bond watch, and we'll talk about Dalton, Brosnan, Craig, and then what might come after Craig in a follow-up video. But again, you see this idea very firmly established that Bond's choices of watch is utilitarian. Going back to Fleming, whether it's the early Fleming Bonds where he's wearing cheap, disposable wristwatches, or he's wearing the equivalent of Fleming's Rolex Explorer, or he's wearing Connery's, Rolex Submariner, or he's wearing Roger Moore's digital era watches. It's a pragmatic choice. When he wears these watches, he's wearing them because of the functionality of them, because of the dependability of them. They're not for him a luxury status good as much as they may or may not be expensive. It's because they are fulfilling a purpose. And that establishes a pretty consistent ethos for what a Bond watch should be, what a Bond watch is. And we'll see how that kind of evolves as we talk about what Bond watches start to become in the Brosnan and Craig eras in particular. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.